the section of the presentation that I'm going to talk about right now is how to actually prepare your work for publication and some of the considerations to put your work together in a compelling way that will secure publication in a strong venue. So this slide basically outlines some of the things I'm going to talk about, the overall process of putting your work together for publication, things that you might want to consider before you even actually start writing the paper, who should be an author on the paper and why that's important, the various elements of a journal article. We've all read journal papers, but why do you put certain material in certain places in the paper? The review and revision process and how that works out and how you should respond, and then some tips at the end to increase your chances of getting your paper accepted. So this diagram really is just a schematic of what happens to a typical manuscript. You first complete the research that you have designed, as was described by Mike in his presentation. You prepare your manuscript, you submit it, it gets assigned to an editor and to reviewers. Ultimately, that leads to the editor making a decision on the paper. Then it's accepted and published. And of course, we all know that every paper we submit goes straight down the middle of this chart. Of course, that's not true. It's much more likely when you submit your work for publication that it's not going to be accepted unchanged. Most papers, in fact, are sent back to the authors for revision, resubmission, re-review, and then hopefully after that, acceptance. Of course, some papers will be rejected right at the very beginning, but the vast majority of papers are going to be revised, and in fact, it's the peer review system that gives you the opportunity to strengthen your work and to get additional perspectives that can clarify your message and make your paper a stronger contribution to the literature. So what about authorship? Why is authorship important? Well, authorship is kind of the coin of the realm in science, in academia. It's the way that we demonstrate our contributions to the field. So it has a great deal of value. And because of this, it's very important that you decide who will be the authors of the paper and the order that they will appear in the authorship list as early as possible. And preferably you would do that even before starting the project. Now, of course, you may need to revise your authorship list as the project evolves. But if you start out thinking that you know who's going to be on the paper, then it's easier to have those subsequent discussions when you may need to add authors or revise their order. The authors should include only those who have made a substantive intellectual contribution to the project and in fact would be in a position to defend the data and the conclusions of the paper in public. So our journals, along with many journals in the biomedical field, adhere to the authorship criteria of the International Council of Medical Journal Editors, and those are listed here. Each author should generate at least part of the intellectual content, whether that be conception or design of the work, or data analysis and interpretation, or in some cases both of those things. Now, you note that this does not require that an author actually have a hands-on role in doing the experiments, which is very good for senior scientists like me, otherwise I'd never have another paper again. But you definitely have to be intellectually engaged with the work. The second criterion is that all authors should either draft, critically review, or revise the intellectual content. So it's not sufficient just to be involved in laying out the manuscript or preparing the figures. It has to be an intellectual engagement. Thirdly, all authors should approve the final version of the manuscript to be submitted. And then finally, and this was a relatively recently added criterion, they should all agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work. So to be an author, all four of these criteria should be satisfied. So, how about the essential elements of a manuscript? We're all familiar with the traditional scientific manuscript that consists of introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And of course, in addition to that, the figures, the references, the abstracts, but the body of the manuscript is really these four pieces. And one of the things that I observe when I'm either reviewing manuscripts or serving as an editor is that sometimes people put things in the wrong part of the manuscript. And that's very difficult for reviewers and readers, because they will expect to go to specific parts of the manuscript for the information that they're seeking. And doubtless, as scientists, you know that you don't always read a manuscript from the beginning to the end. You might just delve directly into the methods if you're looking for a methodological detail, or you may just read the discussion if you don't want to look at the data in detail. So it's important that you put the right information in the right parts of the manuscript. So for the introduction, basically it's based on what was known and unknown. Why did you do the study? What was motivating you to do this work in the first place? In my personal opinion, the introduction is not a place that should contain a summary of the new results that you've obtained. Secondly, how did you do the study? This is obviously the methods section. Should not contain data, should only contain a description of the methods. Then the results section, what did you find? And then what does the new information mean in the context of the existing body of knowledge? And that's what constitutes the discussion section. So we're going to touch on these various topics in a little more detail. So the methods, some tips for writing your methods section. And you'll note that I'm now taking these out of order. And this is actually a suggestion that you write the methods section first. Especially if you're new to writing manuscripts, it should usually be the easiest section of the manuscript to write, and certainly the material that you will be most familiar with. And in fact, you can start writing up the methods section even before you finish the experiments. So for the methods section, it's talking about experiments that have already been completed. So it really should be written in the past tense. You should check the journal to see if it has any specific requirements for the methods section format. The Journal of Physiology and Experimental Physiology, we have no limit on the number of characters or pages for any given manuscript, and so we like to see the methods described in full. But there are other journals that do impose word limits on manuscripts, where you might have to put a significant proportion of the methods section into supplemental information. You should describe the study design and why you chose the particular methods that you did. And you should precisely identify both the models that you used and any reagents that you've used. There is nothing more frustrating than trying to reproduce a particular method and not being able to identify, for example, an antibody or a reagent that was used. As physiologists, we are certainly often concerned with experiments either in animal subjects or in humans. And we are equally concerned that such studies have appropriate approvals. So you should specifically state the approval for your study in the manuscript itself. And the bottom line about the methods is you don't need to reproduce verbatim descriptions of every detail of your method if it's already been published. But there should be enough detail so that others can repeat the work. And if you're reporting a wholly new method, obviously you would need to report that in a great deal more detail than something that is standard. How about the results? Well, this is the next section of the manuscript that I would suggest that you work on after you have your methods put together. And you should think about using a logical order for the results section that doesn't necessarily follow the order that you did the experiments when you were working on the project. Certainly, research projects are not linear. We'll often do an experiment, that'll give you an idea for another experiment, and then you realize that you need to go back and ask another question. You don't have to stick to the order that you actually did the experiments in. You want to tell a story. You should report only the results that are relevant to the question that you've asked in this particular paper. This is not your PhD thesis. It's not a place to memorialize every single experiment that you've ever done related to the general topic. So you want to keep a research paper tightly focused on the research question and hypothesis at hand, but you shouldn't omit data just because they didn't fit or support your hypothesis. And you want to provide enough interpretation of each specific experiment to lead the reader from one experiment to the next. So we found X, we interpreted it as meaning Y, and so the next experiment we did was Z. However, the results section is not the place to include lengthy analysis of the data, nor is it the place to include comparisons with other findings that are already in the literature. And one way that you can check as to whether you have done too much of that comparative discussion is if your results section contains a lot of references. That's usually a key that you have done too much discussing and not enough presenting. So, moving from there then to the discussion section. Obviously, you really can't write this until you have put together your results, and you should be very explicit right at the beginning of the discussion. The answer to your question. Your study was designed to ask a question, so don't let the reader go hunting for this information. Be very explicit up front and state the answer. You can then follow that up with the supporting evidence that you developed through your experiments. Explain how your answer fits in the field as a whole. I would recommend that you discuss your most important conclusions first and then follow up with the secondary conclusions. And in my view, you should write the discussion section in the present tense, because this is what you think about the experiments that were performed right in the here and now. Having said that, there are many, many ways to write a paper, and the information that we're presenting in these presentations really focuses on personal preferences, and you will develop your own personal style. Then finally, the introduction. It may seem a little strange that only now am I returning to talk about the introduction, which basically is the first section of the paper. But I think it's really important to wait till the end to write your introduction. It has two main purposes. One is to get the reader interested in the topic that you're going to address. And then secondly, it is there to prepare the reader to understand your paper, to really get a sense of the scope of the work that you're going to do and the types of approaches that you used. The most important thing that I can say about the introduction is that you should keep it short. You should write it last, and that way you can keep it focused on what you actually showed in this paper. It should have a brief review of the pertinent literature. This is not your opportunity to show the world everything that you know about your topic. It needs to stay focused on the question at hand. It should contain a statement of either your hypothesis or your general research question. And as I said earlier, in my view, it should not contain a summary of the findings that you obtained. So, some tips for success in sort of generally in writing your paper. The first one is that I can't stress enough that you should read the instructions. Every journal is a little bit different. Every journal has nuances in the way that they like information to be presented. So you want to read the instructions for authors. There is a wealth of information there that will help you more smoothly navigate the submission process. You also want to avoid being careless. Check the spelling, check the grammar, check that your manuscript is appropriately formatted. Now, you can write a really beautiful manuscript in perfect English with impeccable grammar, and if it doesn't report anything terribly exciting, it's not going to be accepted. However, the converse is also the case, that If you have exciting data, but it's in an ugly package, it probably will be rejected because the reviewers, the editors, and ultimately the readers will not be able to clearly understand what you did, no matter how exciting the data might be. And there is a natural tendency on the part of editors and reviewers to think that if the manuscript is sloppy, that perhaps the experiments were sloppy too. So if you know that spelling and grammar are not your strong points, find a friend to help you. If English is not your first language, find a native English speaker to help you with the manuscript so that your message comes across crisply and clearly. Make sure that the papers that you cite in the manuscript are, first of all, the appropriate ones, and then also that they're accurately cited. You want to remember who your reviewers might be. If you cite related work, it's quite likely that the authors of that work might be invited to review the work, and they're not going to take very kindly if you either misrepresent their findings or, even worse, spell their name wrong in the citation list. You also want to make sure that the version of the manuscript that gets uploaded is the one that you actually want the reviewers to see. These days, submission systems are quite robust, and it's pretty unusual for there to be an error in formatting of the manuscript itself. The submitting system should compile all the pieces of the manuscript that you upload into a single PDF. But never bypass that stage of checking the PDF prior to hitting the submit button, because it may be that the figures got out of order, or you uploaded the wrong version of the figures, or something with the manuscript is wrong. Sometimes there are problems with fonts or other issues, and you want to make sure that you're convinced that the PDF is what you want the reviewers to see. And then finally, make sure that the manuscript was actually received. Back earlier in my career, when I was the editor-in-chief of another journal, I once got a call from a colleague, and he was pretty upset. And so I tried to find out what the issue was, and he said, "I submitted a paper to your journal 6 months ago and I still don't have a decision." And I was pretty surprised by that, because we prided ourselves, as we do at the Journal of Physiology, on making sure that authors get timely decisions. So we looked into the issue, and it turned out that the postdoc from his lab, who had been given the responsibility of submitting the manuscript, had never actually press the final submit button. So the manuscript just sat in limbo, unreviewed, and nothing happening with it. So you will always get some kind of acknowledgement that your manuscript has been submitted, typically in email format. And if you don't receive that within even minutes of submission, then check with the journal to find out what went wrong. So what about revising? As we said at the beginning of this section of the presentation, just about every manuscript is going to have the opportunity for revision. So if your paper is returned to you for revision, you are in very good company. When we do these presentations in a live setting, I usually ask people to put up their hands if they've ever published a manuscript that was accepted without any revision at all. And it's rare that more than 1 or 2 people would put their hands up. So it's often quite emotionally challenging to receive reviews on your manuscript, even if you understand that the reviewers are mostly there to try and help you make your manuscript better. This is your baby. You've sent it out into the world for review, and you've put a lot of work into it. So it can engender that emotional response. It's okay to get mad about those reviews, but please don't act on it. Resist the temptation to immediately pick up the phone and call the editor and tell him or her that the reviewers are idiots. You can read the reviews, put them away in a drawer, go to the pub, come back in a week or 2, and you'll feel a lot better about it. You want to try and understand what the reviewers are really saying. It may be that they didn't understand your work, But is it because you didn't present it clearly in the first place? And often it's useful to get somebody who's not involved in the project to help you with really looking at the reviews and perhaps making your manuscript a little clearer. And then finally, you want to look to what the editor says in addition to the reviews, because it is the editor, not the reviewers themselves, that make the final decision as to acceptability or rejection. You'll sometimes hear people who've reviewed manuscripts saying, oh yes, I accepted that or I rejected that. But in fact, it's not their decision to make. It's the editor who makes that decision. And it's the editor who will decide how much additional work you may need to do to get your manuscript published. So even if the reviewers call for a number of additional experiments, look at what the editor says in his or her letter. It may be that the editor thinks that all you need to do is some rewriting, but it may also be that more experiments are required. So in responding to those reviews, you want to complete additional experiments if needed. You need to address all of the comments of the reviewers in a point-by-point fashion, and it's a good idea just to cut and paste the reviews in their entirety and then underneath each point to write your response. That way you'll make sure that you haven't missed any points raised by the reviewers, which is also frustrating for the reviewers and the editor. You want to resist the temptation to be impassioned about the points, particularly any points with which you disagree. It is okay to disagree with the reviewers, but you want to be diplomatic about it. And it goes a long way to sincerely thank the editor and the reviewers for helping you to revise and improve your work. They do invest a lot of time in this, and it's usually on a voluntary basis. And then particularly if it's a very extensive review or you think potentially contentious, it's a good idea to get a neutral colleague to review your response.